Nice to see you. Today we have another question, this time from Susan. So she writes, when practicing meditation, I observed something which confuses me a bit. It's mainly about the difference between thinking and knowing. For example, if I know that I'm breathing in or out, there are no words in my head that say, now you are breathing in. It's more that there is a focus on watching the process of breathing. However, I ask myself if that is a thought or mind object too. I observe different shades of detail in thinking. Some thoughts are really sharp and well-defined. Others are just really subtle and nearly formless, maybe close to knowing. So I asked myself if there may be a transition between thinking to knowing, or if both are really distinguished things. So, while thinking and knowing are quite different in nature, well, maybe more different in their quality. A good comparison that may be given here could be the difference between a screen and a movie that plays on that screen. So, thinking would be like the movie that plays on that screen, and knowing would be kind of like the screen on which this movie plays, you could say. The mind in its essential nature is defined as that which is clear and knowing. Clear means that which is formless. So there is no kind of obstructive quality to the mind. The mind is very much like space. So it isn't a material thing. And so that's the mind. The mind itself is clear and knowing. So that the function of the mind is to know. The nature of it is to be clear, formless. And then there are mental objects. Right? So you have various kind of things that are happening within that space. So thinking is one of those things that happens in the space, in the mental space, you can say. So for the sake of meditation practice, you don't really need to find out whether thinking is knowing, or knowing is thinking, whether both are of the same nature or not. It's not really necessary. All that would be kind of intellectual proliferation and keeps you stuck at the level of the intellect, right? And it keeps you kind of wondering, maybe fueling your doubts about the practice in some way. So instead of, trying to figure out whether thinking is knowing or knowing is thinking, or whether there is a transition between thinking to knowing, as Susan mentions here, or if both are really distinguished things. Say if I gave you an answer, I told you it is like this. Thoughts are essentially made of knowing quality. All is mind. Now, what do you do with that? It's pretty impractical, right? You can't really do anything with it. Like a lot of knowledge is just like that. You can't really do anything with it. It's not really functional. It might fulfill the function to make you feel kind of like, oh yes, now I know. Thinking, there's like a transition between thinking and knowing. And the thinking gradually vanishes, and then the knowing is revealed underneath it. So it's almost like the thinking thins out into the knowing. But what do you do with that knowledge? What do you do with this information? It does not remove suffering. That is for sure. You might know those things, right? But you're still suffering. And the question still remains then, why would we want to know that? And I'm wondering this myself, because very often I have questions such as this popping up in my mind, Like, is it this or is it that? Or is it both? Or is it neither? In the beginning, there were more questions like, do we really have past lives? Will there be future lives? Is karma like a sort of punishment and reward system? Like if I'm a bad boy, then I'm punished by karma. If I'm a good boy, then I'm rewarded by it. Is the Buddha not just something in our mind? Are we not just imagining the Buddha? Or is the Buddha a real entity? Is it an entity? And there's so many books and so many texts that speak about these things. And then you read them, right? And then you end up even more confused. And then you think, okay, I got to read the authentic stuff, the real stuff. Then I won't be confused for sure. And then you might read a bunch of really authentic text and you become very convinced of what's written in there. And you think, yes, that is the truth. That is the real deal. And again, it makes us kind of comfortable, doesn't it? You read the very authentic text from that very legitimate source. And then you think, yeah, that must be it. And then you sit down and you meditate and you kind of enjoy a bit that knowledge that I don't really need to pay attention. I just need to do what's in that book. And it just really doesn't work because we're very, very complex beings. And meditation, first of all, before anything, it's about paying attention to what's going on. And any kind of knowledge that's there previous to that might become an obstacle in your pure curiosity. Like if there were no books, if you were just in a forest all by yourself and you had no teacher, but you had just this burning desire to get out of suffering, what would you do? How would you proceed? There's no YouTube, no Wikipedia, no Buddhist books, no holy people, nothing. It's just you there. And you set out on this path to put an end to suffering. Kind of a bit like the Buddha. The Buddha already had to deal with a lot of kind of knowledge that was given to him at that time, right? Like the Brahmin system and, the Hindu system. So he already had that kind of knowledge before he went into the forest to find an answer. And I might imagine that he had to find a way through that somehow. Through this knowledge. Many of those who know me a little bit, they already know that I usually don't give a straightforward answer. I like much more to ask questions. So, yeah, there it is. So Susan writes here, so I asked myself if there may be a transition between thinking to knowing, or if both are really distinguished things. Now look, when you sit there in meditation and this question comes up, and you observe this question coming up, you hear that little voice in your head going, So is thinking actually the same as knowing? Then there's two things you can do, really. One, you can look directly at that question. You can know that question as it arises and see for yourself. But also it's a very subtle question, right? She's not asking a question that is about coarse materiality. It's a very subtle question. It's about very subtle things. It's about thoughts and it's about knowing. So the other option then would be to find out directly. Is it? Is there a transition between thinking to knowing? Are they the same? That's a great question to ask. And then you sit down there and you're not looking for an answer really, but you're looking. We don't want to make anything like fixed with some sort of answer. Here is the answer, but okay, now I can switch up the knowing again. It's almost like that, you know. I mentioned it many times. Sometimes when we go to a place that we haven't been there before and then we don't know how it's called, we have this desire to know how it's called, right? Because when you are there at this place and you don't know how it's called, you are forced to pay attention to it. You don't know the name of that place. So you're in an unrestful state until you know the name. And when someone tells you the name, this place is called such and such, something happens inside you. And if you pay attention to that, it's really interesting. I've noticed that when I know the name, I stop paying attention. I kind of feel like, oh, now I know what it is. So I don't need to pay attention to it anymore. I'm safe in a way. Because once I can label it, I'm safe. I can put it in that box. Ah, that's what that is. This goes for objects too, right? If you see something you drive down the road and you see something right ahead, lying on the street and you don't know what it is. You're wondering, it leaves you restless. You're very alert in that moment. You're really paying attention. But once you know, it's just a plastic bag, or it's just a bunch of leaves. You know what it is, you can deal with it. You can put it mentally into some kind of category. You know what to do about it. And I find that restlessness that is in between knowing a label of something and not knowing that label, it's a very interesting state to be in. What is happening to me just now? What is happening? Happens a lot when you go deeper into meditation. You encounter states that you have never encountered before. The fading away of the senses, for example. Lots of interesting things are happening in that state. When you're encountering these things, very often for the first time, it's confusing. It might be disorienting. It might be, it's comfortable on one hand, and on the other hand, it's something so new that you've never had these kind of experiences. So it keeps you in that kind of alert state you want to know. That's an interesting state to just observe, to just know it. The knowing that we talk about always here, the knowing quality, the knower, etc. It's just awareness. being aware of something. I want to put it in simple terms so that you can make use of it. Sometimes when we say the knower, you might feel, oh, what's that? What's the knower? It sounds interesting. What is that? And it's just the simple fact that you are conscious. And in that conscious quality, there is several layers of depth to that. You can be conscious of many things. Some of them very coarse, like the body and the senses. Some of them very subtle, like a state of no thinking, or a state of equanimity. But these states are very subtle, and yet they can be known, and they can still be known. In a way, you can say they can be experienced. These are experiences. What is experiencing them? So what is it that experiences thought? Or what is it that knows thought, that is aware of thought, that is conscious of thought? What is that? How can you find that out, right? I could just give you another word. Well, that is awareness, or well, that is consciousness, or the knower, or something. But you can't use that. You can't make anything with that, right? Now you just know another word. These questions are bringing you into very refined observation. And in order to do that kind of refined observation, your mind has to become very still, so that you can see these fine subtleties. That, for example, the difference between a fading thought and knowing. Not even a coarse thought, but a thought that is just fading. What does it fade into? Does it fade into something? Or not? And what it fades into, is it kind of made of the same thing, like a wave that comes out of the ocean and goes back into the ocean, essentially being ocean? Does that apply to a thought? Now you want to find that out. And in order to find this out, you have to be very still. If there is the slightest kind of distractions, you can't see it. It's just too subtle. And that's precisely the reason why we need to practice samadhi. And we need to practice to still the mind, to make the mind strong. If your mind is not strong, you can't see that. It's impossible to see. It's too subtle to see. Let me give you an example. You all have a voice in your head, right? You know that you have a voice in your head. So something is talking in your head. Except for you, of course. You give me that look. Okay, so yeah. We all have a voice in our head. And we're looking at that voice. And we let it talk. See what it comes up with. And now instead of paying attention to the voice, just notice what it is that is listening to the voice. Pay attention to that instead. That probably gives you kind of a bit of a knot in your mind. Yes? And that's why we need concentration. Because the mind is way too jumpy and jittery as that it can see itself. Impossible. In order for the mind to see itself, it has to be exceptionally still. I said it many times, and I will say it again and again. And I think it is my duty to say that. There's a lot of spiritual traditions emerging, not even traditions, but like spiritual kind of streams emerging right now that would advertise quite clearly that effort is not needed. And of course, such a message, especially from a guru that has hundreds and thousands of followers, resonates a lot. I don't need to do any effort. It's great. I don't need to change myself. I don't need to do what they call spiritual gymnastics. I'll just only let myself drop into the knowing. I'm just aware. I'm just being. It's enough. And you will have, the problem with that is you might gather this enthusiastic crowd of thousands and tens of thousands of students and followers who are in for the celebration of the simplicity of the method. And they're really fired up and they love it. And it will be very few in that crowd that will actually ask themselves, am I getting what I'm here for? Really? Because it's a mass of people, it has power. A lot of it. Because the teacher is all over the place and appears in highly esteemed shows, etc. So he is seen as an expert. Don't get me wrong, I'm not saying that he's not. It might well be that he's an expert and that his message even is completely authentic and it comes from an authentic place. Maybe he has made his experience that way. As effort dropped away, maybe he has sat 20 years, meditated hard, and really tried to get it. And then he got it in that moment when he did not make effort. And then he might forget, it was those 20 years of effort before that that allowed that to happen. The jump happened because of a lot of this effort that he made before that. And it might then be easy for the followers or the teacher, etc., to say, yes, don't make effort. It is incorrect to say that. It is also incorrect to say, only make effort. And now I'm telling you exactly what is correct. Found myself in a little dilemma here. The problem is when people stop asking questions, that's what I think. That's the problem. You stop asking questions. You just follow something. And you follow it because it's easy and it sounds nice. And it's just not functional, Plus, there is such a thing as a right path. If you ask me, where's 7-Eleven? Do you see what I mean? I can give you a right path and I can give you the wrong path to 7-Eleven. Like some people, they would point just to the right and go, yes. What can you do with that, right? So, okay, maybe it's on the right, maybe not. And maybe someone tells you a beautiful story of this amazing heavenly 7-Eleven that's just around the corner. And so you start wandering off and you're like, okay, it's around the corner, but after 10 minutes walking around, you think, which corner? And then there are people that just get stuck at that. They give up trying to find 7-Eleven and they are just happy with walking around. And then they rectify that, they justify that, they say, it's all about walking around. I've given up 7-Eleven and I found it in my heart. Okay, one might argue that's okay too. Yes, and it is. That's okay too. But if you want to get to 7-Eleven, then there is certain things that you can do to get there. There's ways that are very fast. There's ways that are a bit longer. There's different types of 7-Eleven. You need to know how to get there. And the way to get good results in your meditation practice is by having balance, not just saying, oh, it's only about being, or it's only about just constantly grinding your teeth, or it's only about this or that. There's balance, and getting to know that requires you to ask questions and requires you to pay attention. Again, we're back at that. When you sit down there on the cushion, what are you doing? Okay, you want to know that. What was it again? There may be a transition between thinking to knowing. Okay, I want to know that. Why do I want to know that? So I sit down, okay, I want to know if there's a transition between thinking and knowing, or if it's just really distinct things. What do I really want? Again, I come back to the answer that always applies for me, and it's just, I just don't want to suffer. And what I'm doing right now is I'm suffering. I'm restless, right? I have doubts, I feel tension inside. There's a certain type of tension that does not let me rest. I just can't. So what I really want is rest, not suffering. Now, what does it take to get there? Okay, somebody told me you have to enter the knowing quality. You have to know, detach, release. What does that really mean to me right now? If I'm seeing thoughts, I'm observing thoughts, how can I really understand what they are? There's really only one way. You have to observe directly. And then it will tell you what it is, very clearly, what they are made of. Another difficulty at that stage of asking this kind of particular subtle question is that we're very familiar with matter and material things, and that's a question that concerns something that is immaterial. So we try to kind of take our knowledge of the material world into the immaterial world, and it just does not apply. There is some similarities, and there is laws that are working at each one of those realms. But very often we find ourselves stuck there, we think of thoughts as a thing, for example, or something that is similar to something material. And then maybe the knowing as being immaterial. And so are thoughts thinning out? Or is the knowing something that is similar to a material thing too? And then the way we think, it's often giving trouble at that stage. We can't see clearly because we expect certain things to be in place, or we expect the mind to look a certain way. due to the books you've read, the teachings you've heard, etc., you naturally start to expect things. There's 7 classes of this, there's 3 points of that, there is, etc. While that might be helpful at some point, it can also be detrimental. For example, at that stage where you're asking yourself that question, you want to just look and get your understanding from that observation. And it's really challenging. It's a challenging question. Are thoughts actually... Is there a transition between thinking to knowing? Is there a transition between thinking to knowing? I personally would not really deal with that question. It's beyond my pay grade. I would have to have a mind which is by far more powerful than right now to actually be able to see deeply into that. Because that question quickly, that has a rat's tail to it, it leads to the question of, is everything knowing? I'm lost with that. I don't know. This I have no way of saying, yes it is, yes it is, or it isn't. Could be, but it doesn't help me to say it could be. Another part of her question, or if both are really distinguished things. Now that's also an interesting one. Are there distinguished things? Is this observable? Are distinguished things observable in this moment? That's a good one. Sit down and become quiet and look. Can you see distinguished things? Meaning, here is that thing, and here it starts, and here it ends. And there's this precise cut line at the beginning and the end of that thing. And then that thing exists completely separated from everything else. So it's like we're in this universe that is filled with all these like Lego blocks, and they're all floating around, and they're all kind of separate from each other. And they're bumping into each other and so forth. So it's all these things, right? But is that the case? I found, for example, if I really look, and the mind is somewhat calm, I cannot, for the life of me, find things. It's impossible. The deeper the looking, the more I see everything is... I like to compare it a bit to, when you have the old TVs and you have no channel on, and then it's just this black-white flickering thing going like this. Feels much more like that. So there's just a buzz. But in that buzz, in order to make things, you'd have to be in a very different state of mind to make things. You would have to become much more of a thing so that you can see other things. So your sense of separation to that field has to become more solidified. So you need to perceive yourself much more as a thing, so then you feel you are in a thing, in a world of things. But if you don't perceive yourself as a thing, if everything is buzzing on the screen of the mind or consciousness, whatever it is, there is this existing buzz. In that buzz, there is not much distinction to be found. In order to see distinction, as I said, you have to perceive yourself as distinct. So there appear to be different types of perceiving yourself in the world. Some more refined, some more coarse. Susan has observed different shades of detail in thinking. Some thoughts are really sharp and well-defined. Others are just really subtle and nearly formless. Maybe close to knowing. Here is the question arising, and nearly formless. Maybe close to knowing. They're sharpen your concentration. So my advice here would be sharpen your concentration to a degree where you can perceive those really subtle and nearly formless thoughts as much more clear, sharp, and well-defined. And then look again, because it depends on the subtlety of your looking. If your looking is not so strong, not so clear, then what is actually coarse might appear as subtle. And if your looking is very, very, very unrefined, then what is very subtle would not be seen, and what is coarse appears as just normal. So it depends on the degree of the stability of your mind. So work on your concentration. That would be my conclusion. And then look, answer your question. It's a great question. But yeah, you can see really clearly that this is a limit of concentration, right? You can't see it, you can't answer the question, meaning you need more power in the mind so you can see more deeply. You need a bigger microscope to see, to answer that type of question. You're dealing at the level of bacteria, the level of even something more small. You need a microscope that can see these things. Yeah, that's all that comes to mind. Sorry I couldn't be a bit more clear.